Wow, it's a conception.
The last part of this one? Yeah, because I already did about up to here on a previous one. Okay. As long as someone's listening, I won't feel like I'm talking to myself. Although, did I tell you about my my brother's professor? My brother's philosophy professor. Lectures to the empty room. I'm not quite that egotistical. So in the last lecture, we talked about the Massey case as an example of institutional racism. And you can see that it was a very race-based society, racist society, and you probably didn't grow up, you certainly didn't grow up in a society like that. So how did it change? There's factors that are happening simultaneously, shared experiences, going on strike together, the outbreak of World War II, and then changes in demographics. Demographics is really statistics about things like where do you live, what do you do for a living, who do you live with, how much do you make, your social class, all of that. There are changes in those kind of statistics. So we're going to talk about each one of these. And maybe at the end we'll talk about, have you heard from your ohana about experiences from the territorial period? Okay, this picture here to me represents the territory. It represents putting everybody in their racial boxes. Portuguese, Japanese, Hawaiian, Haole, Korean, Chinese, Filipino, and kind of smashing them all together, and they're not too happy about it. That's the territory, in a nutshell. They're also teaching them these ideas at a very young age to adhere to these racial categories. That pretty much sums it up. Even the fact that the Portuguese girl is looking over at the Haole girl, she's kind of saying, am I with you or am I with them? Because the Portuguese were the intermediaries between the Haole, were really Northern and Western Europeans, and then the non-Europeans. And so that's the question that was there. Am I going to be with locals or am I going to be with Haoles? And the answer was, Portuguese were going to be local. Now that's really interesting because last time I looked at a map, Portugal was in Europe. So how can they not be Haole? But Portuguese don't consider themselves Haole. We don't consider them Haole. You say, oh, are you Haole? No, I'm Portuguese. But isn't it in Europe? Well, it's because of this. When they said, am I with you or am I with them? They said, no, you're with them. And when all the power shifted from the Caucasian oligarchy to the locals, Portuguese were pretty happy to be with the locals, plus they could speak Pidgin, they champion Pidgin speakers. Why? Because they were the lunas, they were the bosses on the horses in the fields communicating with the local people, with the workers. Right? At Lahaina Luna, you're the warriors with Lahaina Luna, lunas, bosses. But actually it means Lahaina Luna Portuguese. Okay. You might have some slides that I don't have here. Did I skip one? No? You don't have this one? Oh, but you have one about strikes? Changes in strike history? The changes were basically that from 1890 until World War II, ethnic groups went on strike separately, ethnic strikes. So only Japanese plantation workers, and Filipino plantation workers. And the plantation owners had set it up so that there were never enough of one group to break the management, if you know what I mean. What do I mean by that? Break the management. Right. So by break the management, I mean give in to the demands of the union. Right. In other words, one ethnicity couldn't successfully strike. They couldn't have a successful strike. After World War II, 1946 on, they had inter-ethnic strikes. Okay, the result here, epic fail. Result here, success. And their slogan of the labor movement was, brothers under the skin. Right? Am I right? Brothers under the skin, because skin color was something, ethnicity, skin color was something that was keeping people divided, and it wasn't until after World War II, when we talk about World War II, they start to see under appearance, under race, we all have the same economic interest. We all want higher wages, we all want our families to do better, we all want education, we want good benefits, good jobs. Now, the reason why it took so long was that the plantations set them up to fight against each other. So they might pay Japanese workers $11 a month and Filipino workers $8 a month. And then what happens? So Filipinos are mad at the Japanese and they're trying to strike back against Japanese. They're really upset. They're never going to unify with the Japanese because they're getting more money for the same work. And they're ignoring the big picture. The big picture is the big boss up above is becoming not the richest people in Hawaii, the richest people in the United States. That's how wealthy they were. It's a divide and conquer tactic, and it took decades and decades to overcome that mistrust. Yeah. Okay. World War II breaks out, and it puts things in perspective. Maybe my enemy is not the guy of another race, but Adolf Hitler, or the Emperor of Japan, or the people who actually bombed us in December. What's the date? December 7th, yesterday, 1941. My mother was 11 years old when it happened. She saw planes flying over her with the rising sun on the wing. My grandparents both worked at Pearl Harbor. So this is, and my mother's very much alive and well. It wasn't really that long ago. Although I know a guy who wrote a book about this. All the decision makers from this period are not here anymore. But there are still people alive who fought in the war and experienced it. In World War II, there was what's called the 442nd. This is pretty well known. It was a military unit, well, there were two of them, 442nd and the 100th. It's 442nd Infantry Regiment and 100th Battalion. And they were made up of almost entirely, not entirely, but almost entirely of what they call AJAs, meaning what? Americans of Japanese ancestry. So they're saying we're American first. Today we call them Japanese American, Japanese first. But they're saying American first. and they're trying to prove their loyalty. They tried to enlist in the military, and at first the military said, no, your country just bombed us. Can't be trusted. They did intern Japanese here, but it was a very small percentage. If you tried to intern all Japanese in Hawaii, that's nearly half of the population. If you do that, you have no economy the next day. So they looked for Japanese who had the closest ties to Japan and especially to the government, and those people were interned. On the mainland, it was happening widespread. But here they had an internment camp on all of the major islands. On this island, it was one of the So these guys formed. They wouldn't let them volunteer, wouldn't let them enlist. So they formed the VVV, the Varsity Victory Volunteers, and they said, if you won't let us fight, we'll work. We'll work for you for free, doing menial labor, digging ditches, clearing brush. And after a while of that, they said, okay, you've proven your loyalty. You can fight in Europe against the Germans. They never let them fight in the Pacific against Japan. Now, those who survived, this became the most highly decorated military units in American history. So those who survived came back as heroes. Not only heroes, but this is the beginning of what they call the GI Bill, which you've probably heard of, which allowed them to actually get a college education. Nowadays, the GI Bill won't really pay. But back then, it would pay for everything. Tuition, books, room and board. You could be a full-time student. Nowadays, it'll pay books, or maybe half of your tuition at a community college. It has not kept up with college tuition. Reason being, nothing's gone up as fast as college tuition. Nothing in the entire economy. Back then, college was affordable. It was made affordable by the GI Bill, and now you have heroes with college degrees, in some case law degrees, qualified for public office. They have what formerly only the sons of the plantation owners had, plus they're heroes. And these guys could see the writing on the wall. They could see that they are the leaders of the new majority. And in democracy, majority rules. So they could see that they had the potential to take over the political system of Hawaii. Meanwhile, people are moving off of plantations. They're the majority. And we're at the point now where there are a second generation, what they call the Nisei. That's the first generation born in Hawaii. They're coming of age to vote. And so, with the unions, you had a way to organize these voters to vote in a way that makes sense for their economic interests. This led to the diminishment of racism, the more equal society that you're now living in, which actually is becoming more unequal, but it's still better than the territory. Less of a contrast between socioeconomic groups. There was only the super rich and then everybody else very poor. But now you had the beginning of a middle class. And that was through the Democratic Party. What's wrong with this sentence here? The proper noun, it's the name of a party. It's not a party that happens to believe in democracy. It's the Democratic Party. So, and in 1954, they had a revolution that we're still living in the outcome of. You got that? We call it the 1954 Democratic Revolution. They had all the ingredients of a revolution. Qualified candidates like Daniel Inouye and Spark Matsunaga. Maybe you've heard of the first one, but not the second. Am I right? but he was the other of the. There are three really big leaders in the movement. It was Inoue, Scott Matsunaga, and John Burns. You probably heard of John Burns, in medical school, named after him. Matsunaga, actually, I teach at UH. I teach in an institute called the Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution. It's like a department. They call it Peace Studies, but it's actually named after him. And then they had a well-organized campaign. You get the voters to vote along with the union. So the union sort of tells them who to vote for and how many times to vote. Am I right? No, that's a joke. You can only vote once, right? But in the very old days, they used to say, you vote for who we say as many times as we say. If you guys join a union, and a lot of you will, if you want to have a decent income, you're probably going to join a union. And the union will tell you, this is the candidate that we feel best represents our interest as a union. And most likely you'll vote for that person. You don't have to. I mean, it's a secret ballot, so. But if you're involved at all in the money flow, the money will flow towards those candidates. And then they had a voting majority. AJAs alone were 45%. If you add other ethnic groups, it was 70 to 75%. They had an overwhelming majority who could be convinced to vote Democrat. And 1954 was the year they really took over. It's not just a one-time thing, but 54, specifically November 2nd, 1954, was the year they took over the entire territorial legislature and the House and Senate. Sorry, the delegate to Congress. They didn't actually get the governor yet until 56 or 60. But pretty much that was when they got into power, in 54. Matsunaga, there's Inoue. In his younger years, he was in Congress from 1960 until 2012. He was the second longest serving, if I'm understanding correctly, second, maybe third longest serving senator of all time. Hard to be number one because number one died in office at age 100. Strong third. Inoue was number two, I think, possibly number three. But he was actually number 4 in the line for president. So Hawaii, in 2012, around that time, was much more powerful than it actually realized in the federal government. They had number 1, Obama. Number 2 is Biden. Number 3 is the Speaker of the House, John Boehner. And number 4 was Inoue as the senior member of the Senate. So Hawaii had number 1 and number 4 for the presidency. Okay, so from a long time before 1954, statehood was something people were pushing for. There were good reasons to do that. For one thing, taxation and representation. Hawaii had taxation, but no representation. Why? Who couldn't vote? Okay, Hawaiians can't vote for their own governor, so that's true. And the representative in Congress, the delegate, can't vote. So you elect somebody to go to Congress and they can't do anything there. That's not representation. Now, wasn't the Revolutionary War fought to have taxation with representation? Yeah. So Hawaii joins the land of the free, home of the brave, and gets taxation without representation. So there's a famous picture of people at the ballot box, and it says, "Make this your last vote." It was at the tax payment. Make this your last tax payment without representation. There are also federal benefits that only states can get, not territories. The best example that you can see in your daily life is the freeway system. Those freeways H1, H2, and H3 are interstates. Interstates, like I-5, Interstate 5 that goes from California to Oregon and up into Washington. How do you have interstates in a state that's an island? How did they do that? It connects military bases. And Inouye was a big part of arguing that strategy. Those are military roads. If you ever have martial law, don't expect to drive on H1, H2, or H3. Look at the freeways. They don't connect towns. They connect bases, right? You go on H2, and you're going towards Wahiawa, and you're almost there, and it turns off right before Wahiawa and goes right to Schofield. Right? H3 does not go to Kaneohe. It goes past Kaneohe and goes right to the Marine Corps base. And those are freeways that connect military bases, so they connect federal facilities, and that's the argument that Inouye and others used to have in interstate freeways. It's the end of second-class citizenship. Okay, those are the pros. Very compelling pros. If you're in the United States, it makes a lot of sense to be fully in and not partially in. Because when you're partially in as a territory, you're a second-class citizen. In fact, you're not a citizen exactly. You're not even really a citizen. Technically, you're called a U.S. national. Kind of like, those are pros. They're pretty strong. Cons, Republicans lose that kind of direct connection, kind of the old boys club with their Yale classmate. Now, look at these cons, though. Who do the cons apply to? Hawaiians and Republicans. In other words, not the majority. The majority of people are neither Hawaiian nor Republican. Most of the majority in Hawaii is Asian Democrat. In other words, none of the statehood. There's only pros. And so that's why statehood passed overwhelmingly. Now there were opponents in the U.S. who said Hawaii shouldn't be a state. These are on the so-called mainland. They're saying it's not connected. Remember, Alaska's not a state until just a few months before Hawaii. So the United States was the place. It's not connected. Senate is always two, no matter how big or small your state is. So 54. So in the House, California is represented proportionally for its size, whereas Hawaii is, in the Senate, is overrepresented. Yeah. So you can kind of understand that argument. And in fact, Hawaii was only 500,000 at this time. So they were only going to have one representative, but 2 senators, just like California. That didn't seem fair. Some people said it's not Caucasian enough. You can't have a state that's majority minority, can you? I'm being sarcastic for the YouTube viewers. That's me being sarcastic. Some people felt it was too pro-civil rights, and Hawaii was pretty strong on civil rights. For example, it was the very first state to say that all people should have equal opportunity based on gender. The other states said race, but Hawaii was the first to say gender. In fact, Martin Luther King, at one of his famous marches in Selma, is wearing a lei, and behind him there's a banner that says, Hawaii knows integration works. Hawaii was very pro-civil rights. A lot of Southern Democrats don't like that. And there were very trumped up charges that Hawaii was communistic because it was so union heavy, so much union activity. There were some union people who believed in communism because communism is a system that says the workers actually control the government. Sounds pretty good if you're in the union, right? And there were some communists in the union, a handful. Literally, you could count them on one hand. It was very much trumped up, although I've met one of these leaders. He's a perfectly safe person for the YouTube viewers. John Kelly, he's famous. He's a perfectly good person. Despite the objections, Statehood, legally or illegally, arrived in 1959, and that created a development boom in the 60s. The development that we're seeing right now is the biggest construction surge since this one. Basically, Honolulu as we know it now was created during that decade of the 60s because Hawaii, as a state, was now seen as a very safe place to invest money. And started to just build like crazy. One last note about this. In 1959, Hawaii was on a list in the United Nations, on a list called the List of Non-Self-Governing Territories. Basically, colonies. So this list was a list of places that were eligible to try to gain independence. Because the UN is founded on the idea that you should self-govern. And taxation without representation is non-self-governing. So Hawaii was on a list, eligible to become independent. And at the US, after the statehood vote, they kind of pressured the UN to take Hawaii off this list. So that was an international implication of statehood. Okay? Questions or comments?